Everyone, Sam again to talk about Chapter 6 of the Take 10 curriculum. This one's on problem solving. Folks, we're almost done. We have this chapter and then 2 more, and then Take 10 is through. It's crazy. But first, let's review our last chapter. So in Chapter 5, we talked about how humans' fight, flight, or freeze response can be activated during conversations, not just during like physical confrontations. And then we also learned some good communication strategies like remaining composed, striving to understand, using I statements, humbling yourself, and listening to hear. And these can be used to try to avoid the fight, flight, or freeze response being triggered in a conversation with someone. And then lastly, we learned Take 10 principle number 6, weapons have no place in solving conflicts in school. All right, so let's get into Chapter 6. So for our do now today, who remembers the steps of the scientific method? Can you remember them? I'm going to give you like 30 seconds to think about this. I'll give you a hint, there are 6 of them. All right, so here are the steps. They might have slightly different names for you, but generally they are identifying the problem, collecting information, forming a hypothesis or an educated guess, experimenting, analyzing the data, and then drawing conclusions. So that's what you might have known already, but here's what you might not know. The scientific method in this like general form like we have it here is actually just like a strategy for solving problems. So if we adapt it slightly, it can actually work for any kind of problem, including personal conflicts. So scientific method works for personal conflicts too. So here are the Take 10 problem solving steps, and note the similarity to the scientific method. So first step, like identifying the problem and gathering info, is to identify the conflict. Now this is deceptively difficult because it can often be hard to acknowledge when there is a problem. Sometimes we'll convince ourselves that we deserve to be treated this way or that the conflict isn't really that bad. So admitting that there is a conflict and naming what that conflict is the first step towards solving it. And the next thing to do is to ask yourself why. Why is this conflict happening? What's going on in me and in that person that I'm in a conflict with that is causing this? That's like the info gathering step, but we just included with identifying the conflict. It's asking why the conflict is happening. And the second step is to brainstorm solutions. So this is like forming a hypothesis. It's coming up with possible ways that the conflict might be resolved. And think about what each person in the conflict wants. Think about what the possible courses of action for you are, what things you could actually do, and what the likely outcomes will be of each of those possible actions. Is there a way that both groups can get at least part of what they want? What will help de-escalate the conflict rather than escalating it or making it worse? And then step 3, like experimenting, is to choose a solution and act. Okay, so I was trying to find a GIF for this slide, and this guy came up, and I just had to include him in there. I mean, just look at this guy. This guy's a real go-getter. It's incredible. I mean, he definitely uses Take 10 to solve his conflicts, for sure. but anyways, so acting on your solution. This is the hardest step in the problem-solving conflict because it's when you're acting, you're actually doing something. And it's obviously the most important because without it, you could just think and your conflict would never be resolved because you'd just be thinking about it and never doing anything about it. So the first thing to do when you're choosing a solution and acting is to form a plan. So how are you going to do it? What steps can you take? What concrete things will you do to resolve the conflict, or at least make it a source of less stress in your life, right? Because maybe some conflicts don't really have a solution that's in your power. So maybe it's just about learning to cope with that problem. So after you've acted on the solution, the next step is to reflect. This is like analyzing the data from your experiment. So did it work? Is the conflict resolved the way you wanted it to be? Did a new conflict arise because of that? This step determines where you're going to go from here and whether you need to repeat the process or try again or just move on. And then the last step is the easiest based on that. It's identifying the next step. So after reflecting, you draw your conclusions from all that you've done. Is the next thing you need to do go back to step 2 and brainstorm more solutions? Or maybe the conflict isn't actually what you thought it was and you need to go back to step 1 to re-identify the conflict. Or maybe everything worked and you're ready to move on. Then that's the next step for you. So these are the steps of the Take 10 problem solving process. Now, one thing we should say here that's super important, so important that we made it into a principle, is every person has the right to choose how they will solve their problems and express themselves. So what this principle means is even though we may see a conflict in someone else's life and really want to help, the best thing we can do to help them is help them through their own problem-solving process. We can't solve the problem for them. If you try, you'll likely come off as condescending or overbearing, and the conflict won't actually be resolved. Often because the people in the conflict haven't admitted that there is a conflict. They haven't done step 1, so they're not able to go through the rest of the steps because they don't even admit that something's wrong, so they aren't open to change or the solution. The other big problem with trying to intervene like that is a lot of times you don't know all the details or complexities of the conflict and the people involved because you're not in it. So the solution that you have in your mind that you think is like perfect and will for sure work, you don't actually know that it's going to work because you don't know all of those complexities, all those details. So again, it's important to help people through their conflicts. That's super important, being supportive and helping people through the problem-solving process. But don't try to rescue people from their problems. Help them through each step, but ultimately they're going to need to do the work to choose how they're going to solve the problem and actually do it. So remember our challenge from last lesson. I asked you to put your dream and plan into action finally if you hadn't done it already, and just reflect on whether or not you achieved your goal, why or why not. So in a way, I was kind of setting you up for failure by doing this before I had taught you the problem solving steps, right? How rude of me. But now that you know all the steps, it's time for an organized and planned, thoughtful do-over. So for the rest of the lesson, for the remainder of the class, I want you to form an in-depth action plan for how you're going to solve the problem you identified way back then. And if you already solved it, good for you. Think of a new problem and try and form a new solution, right? There's always more problems in the world that we can deal with. So write down a step-by-step plan in your journals or in your workbooks through step 3 of the problem-solving process. So identifying the conflict, brainstorm possible solutions, and then choose a solution and start formulating an action plan for how you're going to act. It's important during this whole action plan forming process to collaborate with other people. So talk with other people through the problem that you're having and see if they can come up with other solutions or think about the possible outcomes of the path that you're thinking of taking. So really work together to try and solve these problems together. So that's it for me on this lesson. Your challenge for next lesson is just to follow through, to actually put your plan that you're about to create into action. All right, so you can pause the video on this slide if you want, and then get to work on your action plans. Good luck, everyone.